The Poetry in Transit event was great because
I think we're live, Todd.
we're on live now? Oh, here we are at Word Vancouver. My name is Todd Wong. I'm your host for today. I'm very excited that we have Chiu and Young and Joanna Chiu here as panelists. I'm going to give you our introduction here. So here we go. We would like to acknowledge that this festival takes place on unceded territories of the homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, and you can see their lands right across the water here. And the acknowledgement is that we would like to use this land and be a part of it. Word Vancouver would also like to take a moment to thank our generous donors and sponsors, the Canadian Arts Council, Canada Book Fund, the Canada Heritage Fund, Canada Periodical Fund, the BC Arts Council, BC Gaming Creative BC, the City of Vancouver, DBVIA, the Joseph Wass Family Foundation, and many more of our sponsors. And there is a video, so please do read that, check it out, read our website. This is very good. As I said, my name is Todd Wong. I'm the host. I'm also on the board of Word Vancouver Society and president of Asian Canadian Writers Workshop, which really wanted to have Joanna here. And so Joanna Chiu is a senior reporter covering national and world stories for the Toronto Star, a former foreign correspondent and the author of China Unbound, A New World Disorder. Doggedly reported and fiercely argued according to Publishers Weekly. And the book details China's rapid international rise and the ways that Western nations have contributed to this state of global disorder. China Unbound is the winner of the 2022 Writers' Trust Shaughnessy's Cohen Prize for Political Writing. Wow, I didn't know that. That's amazing. You're also not the star, but you're the chair of New Voices Editorial Collective, which celebrates the creative academic work of women working on the subject of China. And now for Ian. Ian Young is the BC and Yukon Bureau Chief for the Canadian Press, recently appointed earlier this year.
Correct.
He was previously the Hong Kong-based international editor for South China Morning Post before moving to Canada as a SCMP's Vancouver correspondent. And in your 30-year career, Ian has worked as a journalist on 4 continents, including stints at Australian provincial newspapers in London's Fleet Street.
That's true.
Did you ever report anything from Antarctica?
Nothing from Antarctica.
Really? That's so close.
The continent that divided me.
Okay. So I'm going to turn everything over right now to Joanna. Joanna's going to explain about her book, and then we will have some discussion.
Yeah, and talk about Ian's amazing work as well.
Let's talk about it.
Because you're my senior. I have to look up to you.
Thank you, latecomers.
Yes. Hello.
Welcome.
We were actually colleagues overlapping briefly at South China Morning Post. I grew up in Vancouver. At UBC, I really wanted to study everything to do with China. And unlike a lot of journalists going to Hong Kong, like South China Morning Post was like the place to be, the largest English newspaper covering China. It still is.
Yes,
right?
that's right.
And yeah, Ian was a superstar. And actually, when I was after 7 years in first Hong Kong and in Beijing as a foreign correspondent, I really want to go back home to Vancouver. I mean, like, look at Vancouver. People want to be here. But I was like, how am I going to keep working on the topics I want to be working on, like Asia-related, international? But I had Ian as an example because he found all of these scoops living in Vancouver that were related to Hong Kong, related to China. So you kind of like, you basically and others kind of gave me the thinking that, I could have a more international career being back home.
It's interesting because there were so many China stories that were being generated out of Vancouver and out of Canada. And I think that what you've done is sort of synthesize all of that. And it's such an awesome book.
Thank you.
It really is terrific.
Yes. So the book came out of, again, having spent time as a correspondent in China, covering everything. I worked for Wires mostly, like Ian does right now at CP. And if anyone knows about Wires, like Reuters, Associated Press, I worked for AFP, Agence France Presse, and DPA, the German one, as well as, before Economist, South China Post. I worked for a lot of places, but mostly for Wires, and Wires cover everything. And not just news, but like features. So I traveled all over China and for a 4-day trip, I would have to report like 4 different stories. So really, it was a lot of everything. Like ironically, it was when I came back to Vancouver that I focused on really like the political side, and I was just so surprised at, like you said, how many China-related stories were in Canada. My team, actually, we had an office, the Toronto Star's Vancouver Bureau, before sales and advertising dried up and we had to basically fold. And now I'm one of only a few BC correspondents. Just by the, the sheer simplicity of looking on Chinese media, looking at Chinese language social media here in Canada, we did so many stories related to China, including, good and bad. And the bad, if you're here, you would be aware that there are some foreign influence campaigns targeting often more recent immigrant communities, as well as more kind of longstanding Chinese Canadian diaspora communities. And I think that's been overlooked for so long. And as I was starting to look into these things, the two Michaels happened, the Huawei, talk about the China story following me here to Canada. Meng Wanghou was arrested December 1st, 2018.
That's right.
We were here, and the biggest China-related story happened in Vancouver on our doorsteps. Touched up this big crisis that is still, the effects are still lasting today. Michael Kovrig, one of the two Michaels, is actually a friend of mine in Beijing. We, same circles. He wasn't like my bestie, but definitely someone it was such a shock that this happened to him and that he was in detention as a hostage for more than 1,000 days, almost 3 years. Really, it was like a weight during my whole time being back home and writing this book. So I wrote China Unbound to try to help bridge the gaps for people who are interested in China, but as things got more and more tense, I think it reached kind of like a fever pitch where, with so much misinformation floating and lots of political rhetoric, politicians piling in, they wanted to be like the toughest in China. They wanted to provide the best policies in China. I think it was getting hard to know what to believe, like what is fact, what it might be kind of exaggeration. How can you talk about these things without demonizing the Chinese ethnic community? Because I know just walking these streets, because my office was down here, I got, racist slurs a lot. Way more than I did, of course, living in China, where I was one of, many people who looked like me. I didn't encounter racism. I encountered people saying like, your Chinese isn't that good. You should work on it. But nothing like here where it's like people just stereotype you. One lady just laid into me saying that you rich Chinese, blah, 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 coming here, taking our whatever, driving your Porsche into my, I'm like, what? I don't have a Porsche. I was commuting like 2 hours a day into downtown. So I really wanted for this book to center human stories and to lay things out in a very just like deeply researched way so people can feel equipped to actually know what's going on. And also have a conversation about how Western countries, Western societies have been complicit in letting these things fester for so long that suddenly with a crisis like the two Michaels, suddenly people are like, oh, China, what's China doing? And not having actually been paying attention to what had been going on for decades. What Ian has covered, things like the kind of money laundering here, the harassment of critics of Chinese descent, trying to co-opt and trying to push for the self-censorship of media organizations here in Canada. So I guess I'll just read like a couple pages and then we could go on and talk.
Sure. Yeah, just before you do that, I want to say that as you've been reading this, or as I've been reading this book, I've been also finding a lot of other books at the Vancouver Public Library. John Mapplethorpe, he was writing, I can't remember his full name, and so many other books talking about that, and books on Putin and Russia, that the West has been complicit as well, allowing things to happen. Basically trying, as well with Gorbachev, trying to be friends with these countries. Hopefully they will learn more and be more friendly.
Well, I think I argue that it was a lot of the myth that as China became more rich, it would naturally become more democratic, more liberal. In fact, as China became more rich and more stable, I think China's become like it's cracked down more. Living in China, I tell people you can't believe how almost week by week the repression grew more and more, where people who, when I first moved to China, I got to have coffees with, like human rights lawyers. I met with them out in the open. One of my last meetings with a human rights lawyer, he said, meet me at Starbucks. And I showed up and he emerged from the shadows from Starbucks and he grabbed me. He's like, quick, like, come with me. And then we literally like zipped around different alleyways and ended up in a random bubble tea shop. He's like, okay, your phone's off, right? Okay, now we can talk. And then next thing I knew, he was arrested. So, you know, the gradations, it just got worse and worse. It was, and again, the idea, like things like Bill Clinton was talking about, as China becomes more rich, you know, trade increases, China will become more like us, like more liberal. And that hasn't happened. And I think a lot of economic self-interest has affected these dynamics where it's not just China, a lot of countries, because this book, each chapter is devoted to a different Western country and analyzing its history and policies with China. A lot of what's happened is that it's not just with China. Most countries don't have much of a robust anti-foreign interference strategies or protocols at all. To the point here in Surrey, BC, a Chinese Canadian journalist was harassed for months, and police seemed to have no idea what to do. They actually told me on the records, like, we don't have enough translation resources to figure out what's going on. And I was like, there's death threats happening. They're posting it on the video, and they're like, actually, your video is very helpful because you have that caption. I'm like, how do you not have some translation? I hear from Ottawa that they are finally working on some, you know, anti-hostile state actor protocols, right? But then it kind of there's politics involved, and we could talk more about that.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So I'll just read one page, and then we can chat because you told me to read.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So page 105, the Canada chapter. So while United Front activities, can you explain what United Front is first?
Sure. United Front is the Chinese government's, I suppose, outreach program is what you'd call it. And what it is, it's about creating a Chinese government sphere of influence in other countries. And it targets mainly, as Joanna lays out, diaspora communities. So in a lot of ways, although this outreach program is something that is done to other countries, it's primarily done to diaspora communities in those other countries. And that's why it's, you know, I think that Joanna's book is so important because it centers the diaspora communities in a way that I think that a lot of, you know, traditional analyses don't. So, you know, that's why I think it's important. Yeah.
I guess there's the idea that I trace back to history, where even in the Qing dynasty, before it fell, there was a paranoia about overseas Chinese going abroad and rallying support to, you know, as to be detractors to, and it happened. Sun Yat-sen, he studied in Hawaii. He rallied funding from overseas Chinese communities, and basically he toppled the last dynasty in China.
My ancestors did that.
That was you.
They gave
You
money
guys.
to Dr. Sun Yat-sen.
Yeah.
And the Chinese diaspora here saw how a democracy was working. They thought, oh, that would be better than the Qing Empire. Yes.
Yeah. So.
And it's all part of that big China mythos, isn't it? That we're all products of Chinese heritage, and that it's incumbent on all ethnic Chinese to, you know, kind of, I suppose, support the state or support the motherland.
Support the motherland.
Support the motherland.
Because this idea that all Chinese are Chinese, it's helpful to try to avoid the alternative, which is the truth, which is, you know, ethnic Chinese are so diverse and have been all around the world for many, many generations. But the focus in United Front has been for a while, and I think we're only learning about it more recently, because in more recent years, they're reaching out to more elites, like Western, white elites, to co-opt them as well. But for a long time, for decades, most of the, you know, target was, you know, immigrant communities. Like, you're going to stay loyal, you're not going to be critical. And partly it's because of the shared language. They're more worried that if there's some sort of really popular critic living in Vancouver, that their work in the Chinese language or is bilingual could more likely reach a domestic Chinese audience. And as I try to explain in the book, a lot of the reasoning behind what we would feel are irrational crackdowns and wolf warrior diplomacy from China, a lot of it's directed at the domestic audience and trying to make sure that they stay patriotic. So while United Front activities are perhaps most obvious in a country like Canada with our large ethnic Chinese population, it's happening in a number of countries. And Canada is just an example of what's going on internationally in China's treatment of middle powers. So my research found that China's might be a bit more brazen in its kind of intimidation of middle powers because it feels it can, because we're not as powerful as bigger countries. But if Canadian leaders had paid heed to testimonies about Beijing's harassment and meddling in Chinese diaspora communities decades ago, vulnerable people might now feel safer to express their views in Canada. So one of these examples, I went to Toronto and met with a veteran documentary filmmaker, publisher, activist named Churk Kwan. He's now in his 60s. You must know him. He's well known.
For his films on Chinese restaurants.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I met him at a Cantonese seafood restaurant overlooking Toronto's Harbour front, and he ordered really well as a foodie. He was wearing all black, looked very artistic. And, you know, unlike people who are a bit older in his generation in Beijing, when I was living there, who deflected my questioning about politics, he was very eager to talk about the past. He said in 1980, he co-founded the Chinese Canadian National Council, CCNC, an organization with a mandate to monitor racial discrimination and educate youth about the contributions of Chinese Canadians. In the wake of the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre, the group pivoted, took a stand, called on Ottawa to accept more refugees and help political refugees. But what happened next left him utterly bewildered. What we did, he said, pissed off the Chinese consulate. So they started their own group to counter our work. They call it the National Congress of Chinese Canadians, the NCCC, whereas they were the CCNC. And in my notebook, he wrote out even the Chinese names side by side. They looked very similar. So this rival group organized yearly celebrations of the establishment of the People's Republic of China. To Kwan's consternation, many Canadian politicians accepted invitations to join in such celebrations, granting them legitimacy. The NCCC, this consulate group, became bolder, issuing statements that were pretty much opposite of statements from Kwan's group. For example, when the CCNC asked Canadian leaders to apologize for the racist head tax Canada placed on Chinese immigrants, including my great-great-grandfather from 1885 to 1923, and provide compensation to affected families, this other group issued statements saying, actually, no compensation would be necessary, no apologies necessary. So in a way that basically it was the opposite of whatever Kwan's group wanted to put out, just to kind of sow confusion, not necessarily to always
because
promote a pro-China.
I was involved with the the nationalist group, our Chuck's group in Vancouver. He was in Toronto, and what happened is that the NCCC group actually talked to our Chinese Canadian veterans who had voted and fought in World War II and had always asked for apology because they thought that's all they would ever get. They grew up during the time of the head tax and systemic racism, and at least get that. My granduncle would always ask for that. But in the end, what happened is the Liberal government that was talking with them and wanted to create the ACE program got voted out of office. So Stephen Harper's Conservatives came in and they ended up working with the groups and giving an ex gratia payment and helping to start more education programs. But again, there's how the two groups are going at different perspectives.
But with completely different origins. One's a
Yes.
grassroots group and one is a top-down group.
And the amazing thing at that point was that for the ACE program with the Liberals, there were so many community organizations on that were bogus.
Yeah, so
They did the same names in French and English, and it was the same.
So there's a term for this. Does anyone know the term for making up kind of similar but questionable groups?
AstroTurf.
AstroTurfing.
Mhm.
It's a practice of masking an organization's sponsors to make it appear grassroots. It's a very popular strategy of the United Front. And this tactic emerged in the 1980s in cities like Vancouver with large Chinese immigrant populations. When I traveled to Australia, that happened so much in Australia, perhaps actually more in Australia, interestingly. So yeah, it has been pretty successful in sowing confusion. Kwan, he testified in 2006 to the Canadian Parliament. I saw a transcript. What he said, is still so relevant today. So a lot of what I question is, to this day, Canada and many other countries still doesn't have a comprehensive counter-interference strategy. Efforts to guard against foreign bribery, money laundering are also shockingly low, especially when compared to similar-sized countries like the UK or France, according to a review from Transparency International Canada. So even among middle powers, I found that Canada actually has a pretty low level of kind of a foreign security mindset. But it's complicated because these things you don't necessarily want to criminalize. To me, some of my what I came away with, like, I think awareness from the public can go so far, even beyond and even with legislation. I think just basic awareness among media, among citizens, it will help so much to make sure that these tactics aren't as successful.
I think that one of the big things is that there's for a very long time been an absence of people who can read and understand Chinese and who are also part of the Chinese communities in Canada. And so it was very easy for these astroturfing organisations to claim that ground.
Yeah.
And for reporters, not necessarily being gullible, but just not knowing better, would find themselves swept along. And that's how those groups came to prominence.
I find that to this day, a lot of these groups are English websites, and the Chinese versions are so different.
My goodness. Yeah.
The English ones are pretty short,
very
to the point,
very
about just cultural friendship ties. But you switch over to the Chinese version of the website, it's like, we're a United Front group. We report to the Chinese government. We welcome the liaison committee to come over. We send delegations to Beijing. It's in their charter. Again, one of our stories was just translating the charter.
It happens very transparently if you're looking at the right version of the website. It happens in plain sight. Yeah, for sure. But I think that for the longest time, it was viewed as this very, very opaque thing. But it's not actually that opaque. Yeah. It's not actually terribly opaque. I think in the Chinese communities, there's been misunderstanding about what's going on. But for some reason, that hasn't been able to break through into non-Chinese speaking media. And so it comes as this big surprise when this happens. But we've seen this really recently. I mean, I think we saw during the course of the Hong Kong pro-democracy protests, we saw various groups coming out with open letters claiming, I think, to represent the Chinese community as a singular entity, and disavowing the Hong Kong protest movements, and signing these open letters and publishing these treatises on the front page of newspapers. And we've even seen it very recently talking about Taiwan, to the extent of these groups citing Chinese government policy, citing Chinese government white papers as their inspiration for writing these open letters. And so it's happening very, very openly if you're looking at Chinese language publications. And that's a big blind spot. It still is a big blind spot. I think that this book has helped, and people are more aware of it now, but it's still a very, very substantial and dangerous blind spot for the Canadian media.
When did you start the Vancouver blog?
This is a blog that I started in about 2013 to address sort of these blind spots, because when I started here as a foreign correspondent, I think that it's interesting to be on this panel with you, because you're a foreign correspondent who was based in China, reporting for, I think, mainly Western organisations, whereas I was a foreign correspondent based in Vancouver, doing quite similar reporting, but for a greater China, Sinosphere type audience, based in Hong Kong. So it's two sides of the same coin, but we end up doing, I think our work overlaps very substantially. And when I started in around 2012, it was kind of an open field to report on that stuff. I was thinking about this this morning. that back in 2012, it really was an open field for this kind of work. And that's why, I mean, I like to take some credit, but that's why there were so many stories that were going unreported because no one was looking at them. Now it's very different. Now I think that you've opened things up a lot. The book's made a big difference. But the dynamic with China changed. I think that from 2012, things moved so fast. We had the umbrella movement in Hong Kong. We had the Meng Wanghou. We had the protest movement in 2019. We had national security law. All those things reverberated through Vancouver and Canada's Chinese communities. So there was a lot to report on, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think before that, Vancouver and Canadians, as we're pointing out, were very complacent about what's happening in China, and that we would see China as like 1970s China or 1980s
Well, I think
China.
that there's a premise that I think that there, up until quite recently, there has been an understanding of viewing these big geopolitical movements almost through a prism, a very, very narrow domestic prism, and that's been one of victimhood. And I don't think that's quite adequate when you're talking about things that the Chinese government is doing. Can the Chinese government's actions be understood through a prism of victimhood? There's a victim mentality, I think, that exists from the century of humiliation, but it's very different to seeing. There's very limited value in seeing the Chinese government as a vulnerable group, and I think that so much has changed in the way that China is expressed in Vancouver. Previously it was. I mean, I think there was very reasonable ways to view China through a previous prism of historical contact here in Vancouver and through the head tax and through through that prism. But it's changed very, very rapidly. And I think those old understandings of where strength lies and whether or not it's something that needs to be counted or at least acknowledged, that's changed so much.
Yeah, I think whenever you talk about these issues, you have to talk about racism. And to me, I think you can work on those things simultaneously.
Exactly.
You can criticize what Beijing is doing, its abuses against its own people, Chinese people, who actually don't vote for any of their leaders. They kind of vote among themselves, and Xi Jinping gets to be emperor for life. And then there's the Chinese diaspora that suffers anytime people have more awareness about the CCP's abuses. They're the ones who get punched on the street. Like I feared for my parents, especially early in the pandemic. And these things happen at the same time, but you can still work on racism and address China's colonial experiences to help it try to understand, not to excuse, but understand the mentality of feeling this great chip on their shoulders, that they were humiliated by Western powers. I think it can come, side by side, but we literally see comments from Trudeau and others saying, "Oh, we can't talk about this. It's discriminatory or it's racist."
Inflame things. I mean, I think that we're past the stage of worrying about things being inflamed when we've got the situation of the two Michaels. I mean, China is very assertive, and the way that it expresses itself through the United Front, it's very assertive.
So that's one of the things that that Joanna writes about, the change in the policy that China used to be find something that doesn't offend people, but now they go for the wolf warrior diplomacy, which is being more assertive. And that for people who might not understand the century of shame was, again, the 1800s into the early 1900s, but with the rise of China recently becoming a global power and flexing its muscles, taking its place on the Security Council from Taiwan, the Republic of China, the little place there.
Yeah, I was just in Taiwan earlier this month. It was really interesting to see.
Oh, yes.
How people there are actually worrying about the chance of invasion now. I thought it was all like hype from people outside Taiwan, but people in Taiwan, they kind of have this kind of very pragmatic attitude, but they do worry that all of these tussles between the US and Beijing, all these missile tests, like it could affect them. I visited places where people were learning emergency first aid, learning how to, deal with bullet wounds and things like that. Like there's this kind of prepping mentality in Taiwan because of these tensions.
Yes, I was in Taiwan in 1980 as a student, and we toured the military college and we saw murals. They still had a dream that they would retake the mainland, which I think people are, it's impossible at this point. But the one China, two policies,
One China policy.
yeah, one China, two policy, yeah, one China, that's going to be really difficult to deal with because now having received Hong Kong and looking after that, the laws are changing.
Well, I think people were because Xi Jinping, he said that to achieve the rejuvenation of China, that Taiwan will have to be reunified with the mainland. And, people worry what might happen, but both sides seem to be happy with the status quo. But the U.S. is another factor. They passed the Taiwan Policy Act, which will infuse $6 billion or more in military aid to Taiwan, kind of elevating Taiwan to a major non-NATO ally like Israel. So these kind of complex geopolitical dynamics are increasing worries and the chance of some sort of conflict. And I think my last chapter in the US is actually quite critical of Washington's policies because the rhetoric there really seems to be like there's no room in the world for two superpowers, that there is this competition with China rather than kind of a coexistence. And, there's kind of a militaristic hawkishness that I see quite dominant in the States. Not as much here, but I feel that side is not very healthy either. Like, what do you think? Like, some people criticize your work.
Well, I mean, I think I'm a little bit worried because things move fast. I think what Hong Kong has shown, what happened in Hong Kong and what's unfolded in Hong Kong has shown that developments move very quickly. We talk about what happens in Taiwan and the tensions there. And there is a strong argument to be made that Xi Jinping will, maintain the status quo because it's not in his interest to have a hot war. But on the other hand, could you have imagined that Hong Kong would be where it is today 4 years ago? 3 years ago almost. Just before the protests erupted in 2019, it would have been inconceivable to me that Apple Daily, the biggest newspaper in Hong Kong, would have been shut down. That people that I knew and respected and were well-regarded Democrats across the entire community would be rounded up and arrested, which is what we've seen. So we've seen this wholesale transformation of Hong Kong that pretty much happened overnight. And so I think that's a big concern. So if the question is, does Taiwan worry me? Taiwan worries me very much because things move quickly, and China's moved from being sort of a collective dictatorship to an individualistic dictatorship, and things move much quicker, I think, in that sort of situation.
Yes, and Xi Jinping has made himself more of a centralized leader of everything than his predecessors. He's head of the military, and he's consolidated a lot of the structure of the CCP, which in the past was more bureaucratic and at different levels. But I was in China when he kind of consolidated more and more. But what's interesting, looking towards the future, he's almost late 60s now, so wondering, there doesn't seem to be a clear successor plan for who will lead China next. So for some people, they see that as a ray of hope, that it can't get worse, right? A lot of people have this idea it can't get worse. And at the end of talks, sometimes they say young Chinese people, they're not, on the most part, very ideological. They're not like running to join the CCP. A lot of them share in confidence in private rooms their frustration with what's happening, that China's closing inwards and making more enemies than friends is really limiting their future opportunities. So I do have some hope in like the younger generation.
And we're seeing that in Russia now too, that Putin consolidated lots of power. He's pushing into Ukraine, looking at other places. China has disputed territories. This might be a good time for China to push that way too. But part of it is, I want to ask you, with all these changes going on in China, what are some of the ramifications? What are we feeling here in Vancouver and Canada because of that?
We see it now. I mean, we're seeing it being expressed now. I mean, you're seeing the Chinese communities being asked to take sides on Taiwan and on Hong Kong and on the various democratic movements. And we've seen this explosion in these astroturfing groups that are staking out territory and claiming to speak for the Chinese communities here. I don't know how successful they've been. I don't know to what extent that's inevitable. I don't think it is, because I think that the Chinese communities in Vancouver are very, very, very far from being monolithic and homogenous. You know, you've got this vast array of ideas that exist. But then again, there's always been, a substantial cohort that are very, not only patriotic towards mainland China, but are strongly supportive of the government, strongly supportive. I mean, for the 100th anniversary of Mao's birth, there was a very, very large party here in Vancouver. In Richmond, there was a very, very large publicly publicised event to celebrate Mao's 100th birthday.
And did some of the people here, or United Front people, invite Canadian politicians to attend that?
Well, I don't know about that, but because I think that would have been a bridge too far to have, the mayor with Mao projected on the backdrop. But we have seen attempts to exert themselves on City Hall, absolutely.
Yes, so Joanna writes about that in the book. Could you speak to that?
Well, yeah, like a lot of things. Like I spoke with a city councilor who was just, I think something that a lot of people don't know is just the sheer availability of resources for this work. Someone told me he was running for city council, not even an elected politician yet. And he got an email from the Chinese government saying, would you like to come to China on a VIP paid trip to learn about the new Silk Road project, investment project? And he said, like, in my community, cows outnumber people, and they reached out to me, which shows like the resources available. And I have a piece in the Toronto Star you can read for free. It's called Prime Targets, and it explains actually lower level politicians in Canada, Australia, US are often the prime targets. Trudeau has also been in some scandals where he's in like closed door fundraising events with some known United Front figures. But on mostly what you see happen is, city councilors get invited to kind of things that sound innocuous, but I spoke with someone and I'm like, are you aware that your photo where you're shaking hands and making speeches is on all these websites where at the events people are up talking about how they should try to elect candidates who are more pro-China, or they should, make somehow Canada support China's position in South China Sea. But these politicians in Canada not understanding Chinese, they're literally sitting there and smiling and nodding.
Nodding away.
And I've seen videos and photos, like this is so common. And I spoke with, the relevant government officials. I'm like, is there like training?
What I would say though is that a lot of that is for domestic consumption.
Yeah,
a lot of that is for domestic propaganda value rather than sort of than necessarily being terribly impactful on the local scene. But you do talk about a very interesting example of Sam Dastyari in Australia, who was an Australian senator who got into all sorts of trouble.
And you are Australian. So
I am Australian. I'm Australian Chinese, in case your accent didn't give it away. But yeah, Sam Dastyari was a Labor Party senator who got himself in trouble because he was receiving money from a China-connected businessman, and there was impact. I mean, he ended up speaking out in favor in a way that contradicted policy
on the South China
Sea. So it can be impactful.
And he actually got funding to cover some of his debts from this businessman. And in Australia, it was interesting that reaching that high level of a senator, then they went around and they started looking at legislation that not only applied to China, but emphasized it applied to all countries.
That triggered a very profound discussion in Australia, those sort of things. We haven't, it's interesting to me, we haven't had that level of profound discussion yet, even though we've had things like the Meng Wanghou and the two Michaels. I would have thought the two Michaels would have triggered something more profound than it did, and it's sort of surprising to me that it hasn't.
I think the Canadian government wanted to not rock the boat because, outwardly they said they're worried about the safety of the Canadian hostages, but now that they're released, there's still nothing. There is a kind of like don't anger Beijing vibe I get in certain parts of
Oh,
Ottawa.
absolutely.
But I think there's a lot of infighting
Mm.
among politicians too. Definitely, I think
Although
CSIS is not happy.
they did eventually
Mhm.
block Huawei from 5G.
In May of this year,
Yeah.
really late.
Well, yeah, one of the things on your book, because you're writing about Canada, you also look at Hong Kong, and we've talked about that, the effects of Hong Kong, Canada, Australia, Italy, with their new Silk Road project, which also has an effect in Greece, where they basically bought a port.
The Port of Piraeus.
Mhm.
Um,
Which where they're controlling a lot of the imports and exports. And here's this section on Turkey and Russia, the United States, the effects of going on with China creating a new world disorder and taking more credit and pushing, but also working with what we knew as, or would refer to as third world countries that have debt and buying in to do revitalization. And actually, the countries now, in some sense, become beholden to China.
I think that is like the most like complicated kind of area to delve into, because in many cases in Greece, even talking to the dock workers union, at first they were protesting the Chinese state-owned company takeover of the dock, but after a couple of years they're like, actually our wages have sort of increased, our work standards haven't decreased, and the port is running better. They're overall supportive. Like the Greek president at the time was against it, and they did a complete U-turn, and now they're all for it.
But that also means that at the United Nations,
Yes.
you have Greece voting to support
Yes.
Chinese
So
initiatives
Greece
or against
vetoed,
things. Yeah.
for the first time, Greece as a EU member vetoed a human rights criticism on the UN Human Rights Committee against China. And people wonder if there's tit for tat, or if it's Greece being kind of proactively being grateful to China for its economic help. But this economic help, I would argue that it's not all debt trap diplomacy. A lot of it is actual investments in infrastructure that is actually useful to these places. And
sometimes it's places that,
Yeah.
that other countries have stepped backwards from.
Yeah.
I think that we've seen that recently in the South Pacific with Australia, having reduced a lot of funding for smaller countries like the Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea and what have you, and Australia having, for I think probably short-sighted reasons, stepped back from those kind of fundings. And all of a sudden, China is very, very willing to step into the breach and say, hey, we'll pay for that. We'll build that road. We'll build that bridge for you. And, you know, if you're a small country like the Solomon Islands, why wouldn't you? You know, I think that there's the bigger and the middle powers take a lot of responsibility for that. You know, I mean, step up to the plate.
And the U.S. under Trump, like, you know, withdrawing from the Paris climate change agreement, like trying to really, like, you know, undermine the WTO, UN levels. I think that's created kind of like a vacuum of leadership in the world that China is very happy to help fill. And China, I try to explain, they don't want to dismantle international law and organizations. They just want to kind of be a part of it, be influential, and mold it to a way where these organizations make the world safe for dictatorships. China's trying to rewrite the word democracy to mean that any country, regardless of regime type, should have respect on the world stage, should be able to be involved. And it's an interesting dynamic because traveling to these places like Italy and Greece and Turkey, a lot of these arguments are actually convincing to them, compelling. A lot of people are disillusioned and angry about the world as it is, with American hegemony, American hypocrisy when it comes to preaching all of these great lofty ideals, but actually committing war crimes, starting wars, propping up dictators. So China's message and its funding and its money is very compelling to a lot of countries. It's compelling to Canada. So it's complicated, I think, and all of these dynamics.
Yeah, and I think that China's been quite nuanced in the way it leverages some of those arguments. You know, who are you to to point this out? Who are you to,
Yeah.
and holding up examples of hypocrisy, and even in the realm of human rights, they've leveraged the unmarked graves here in Canada, even. Who are you, Canada, to lecture us on human rights? There's quite a lot of subtlety there.
So we're at 15 minutes left right now. I think there may be some people who want to ask a question, but before we do that, is there another topic or something you want to bring up very quickly that you felt we haven't talked about? No?
I think we've covered a
Yeah,
lot of
I
good
think
things.
just ideas to look for Chinese Canadian journalists, Chinese Canadian researchers, and read their work and what they're doing, because when they're actually in communities, I think that's where you get more nuanced research, because if you're Chinese or if you are in the communities, you're not going to produce things that are necessarily going to be very harmful or one-sided or
I think
misleading.
I think there's been this sort of big segregation in the media scene here in Vancouver regarding China and Chineseness and the diaspora communities, and I think the sooner that's put to bed, the better, because it's Vancouver's on the kind of cutting edge of these vast geopolitical shifts. It didn't, it came out of the blue that Meng Wanghou was arrested, but it didn't surprise me that it happened here in Vancouver, because Vancouver has for years been the exact place where a billionaire's daughter would have a spare home. Exactly that kind of place where those kind of dynamics exist, where someone like that might have entered under a millionaire migration scheme and be sharing time back and forth between China and here, because that's kind of what happens, So it wasn't terribly surprising. I think that the incredibly profound impact of that was very, very surprising. But the type of person that Meng Wanghou is, that's not surprising at all that it happened here.
I think I saw an episode of Vancouver Real Housewives that featured very rich Asian women, with Chinese backgrounds.
There's plenty of those.
Oh yeah,
but it's good not to get caricature it as well. I think you have to be careful. Money behaves the way it behaves because it's money. Millionaires behave. When Chinese millionaires move here, it's not because they're Chinese necessarily; it's because they're millionaires.
Yes.
It's the problem with that situation isn't about Chineseness; it's about millionaireness and the mobility of money. And it is to do with very specific rules that China has in place about what money can and cannot do in China and the way they try to control that. Capital controls. And to that extent, it's about Chineseness, but it's to do with Chinese policy, not really to do with Chinese people.
Yeah. And when you look at what life is like in China for even rich business people who have to operate in so many, need to have Communist Party cells in their businesses. They can't use certain VPNs to access the internet. So it's not surprising people want to move here. Right? So yeah, let's open
China
it up.
has changed so much over the last few years. So we have a question.
Yeah, just talking about that, the big part of China being journalists based here, does that prevent you from interacting with people in China or reading their social media in China, or how does it influence you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I was studying at UBC in New York, trying to do some class assignments on China, it was so difficult to reach people in China, especially then when WeChat wasn't a big thing. Once WeChat became a bigger thing, you can find basically any source on WeChat. The problem is, that you're not the only one who could be talking to them. Like there's automatic censorship on WeChat, and then there's, actual hacking, spying.
And self-censorship.
So it's really tough to talk to sources in a frank manner, especially with the privilege of being in Canada, where they are in China.
And a VPN is something of a privilege too. The kind of voices that you get out of China are de facto filtered by access
What's
to
that
VPNs,
VPN?
virtual private network.
Yeah, so they use it to jump the firewall, and it's hard in China. Like when I was even first moving there, working there 2012, 2010, I downloaded so many different VPNs to find one that worked. So the people you can reach who can use WhatsApp, Signal, Telegram, they're people with some privilege or people who are willing to take that risk. So you might reach voices who aren't arrested yet, who are going to be quite critical. But I think that's why I advocate for media and governments doing all they can to support foreign correspondents actually still living in China as much as they can, advocating for visas to be issued to these journalists and not revoked, because there's really nothing that replaces actually having people living there. The friendships you make, the ordinary people you see just walking down the street, that provides like a nuance and layers to the China story that you can't get here. That I worry I no longer have. Even just being in Taiwan for 10 days, I felt like I kind of fact checked and kind of figured things out a lot easier than I did here. But there are ways to reach people. A lot of it is having the networks and knowing who the kind of connectors are. But again, it involves reading Chinese. So I think promoting Chinese language learning in high schools and elementary schools and universities instead of shutting them down, which is across the Western world, that's what's happening. Chinese language instruction is pretty much non-existent in most universities. The Confucius Institutes, China related, used to provide a lot of language learning, but very there are good reasons for them to now, be seen as suspicious because they do promote a very pro-China way of things, but they haven't been replaced with universities' own language instruction programs. And that's a big deal because we don't have that generation of policymakers, people in government, journalists who can tell the China story in a more informed way. And Chinese is hard. It's been a long time and I'm still working on it.
Good. Is there another question?
So I've been pretty heavily involved in Richmond politics, local, provincial, and federal. And in the course of being involved in that work, I have tried to find ways to get politicians there to speak up against the foreign influence campaigns that have been happening. I have utterly failed at that. It is an extremely delicate matter for politicians there to take on. And I've seen a lot of stories, neither of which have been done by you. I would say by some less scrupulous reporters who have said stuff like, hey, this politician, shook hands with somebody from the Chinese consulate.
Yeah.
This person shook a hand with, I know a lot of these people personally. I have nothing in my experience with them to suggest that they're CCP linked, but nevertheless, there's media reports that still link them, understandably, because they're in these photos with these people. I guess I'm just wondering, in an environment like we're living in right now, like after what we saw happen to Kenny Chiu, the conservative MP, and Alice Wong, the conservative MP, get targeted by a foreign influence campaign, in a place like Richmond, where the community is huge and where, sadly, these influence campaigns have enormous influence within the community, exactly what kind of a balance are people in a majority Chinese city like Richmond supposed to do? To stay in office, but also speak up on these things?
Be informed. I mean, I think that you say that there's been a lack of interest. I think that you're talking about a lack of interest from the candidates themselves. They must surely be aware at this stage of the game that this is something that's incredibly important.
They don't want to talk about it.
When I say lack of interest, there's a lack of interest in actually speaking up in a forceful way that needs to be spoken up.
Because they worry they will get targeted by this massive, smear campaigns.
Well,
They know what's going on. It's just they kind of try to treat it as a geopolitical matter and not a local one.
Well, people should be careful about who they shake hands with, I guess. But I mean, that's not to say that you don't shake hands with someone who comes up to you necessarily. But what I find frustrating, though, is when local politicians are willfully ignorant. I don't think what you're talking about is a willful ignorance. I think you're just seeing something that's a little bit too that they're frightened, I suppose, of stepping up. I don't know what the answer is to that. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I wish I could come up with an answer. I'm not a political advisor, but surely after books like Joanna's and the kind of reporting that has happened, that they can surely see that the community is not homogenous. I suppose that's probably the advice, understanding that the communities are not homogenous, and that for whatever risk you may stand of offending someone, you're not going to offend everyone. I mean, that's politics, isn't it? I mean, you do have to ultimately take a stand one way or the other. And what these influence campaigns play upon is the notion of homogeneity. And it's a false notion of homogeneity in the Chinese communities.
But what I would say is that there are things that we could do that we aren't doing to combat misinformation. In Taiwan, they have passed legislation, and there's there's accounts, a lot of Taiwan's version of WeChat or WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger is Line. And the government has started these accounts that are monitored by teams of people. You can literally just text them, like, is this a true piece of information? And they will get back to you, be like, actually, this is just a rumor, or this is malicious misinformation. It's easy. You just message someone and they will get back to you. Or every government agency in Taiwan has someone who is in charge of really quickly in real time responding to disinformation. So if there's anything related to their work that's circulating on social media that might be questionable, they investigate it, and then they quickly put out a clarification notice. Well, actually, this is what is actually the case. Canada has nothing like this, right? It's kind of, I think, a lot incumbent on individual media to kind of track these issues. So there's a lot we can do without passing legislation to combat misinformation, especially in different languages. WeChat is censored by the Chinese government, but people can use it in Canada. So what I've tried to explain to people is that a lot of, especially recent immigrants who are vulnerable, who might be encountering racism on the streets, they are in this kind of online ecosystem, which is censored, which is kind of has this information that about Canada that is often misleading, and it's deliberately targeting them maliciously. And basically, Canada is really not doing anything about it. They investigate, egregious examples after the fact, and different political parties are complicit. The Conservative Party, they put out an ad that was anti-Trudeau. They paid someone to spread these rumors on WeChat that Trudeau would legalize hard drugs and their kids will all get. And there's a conservative investigation over who okayed that, but it's almost kind of Chinese populations in all our diversity are kind of seen as this group that you can target, even among Canadian politicians. So it's so far from actually having systems in place that we're actually protecting these groups, helping them stay informed, making them feel welcome. So there's all of these things that we could do. We could learn from other countries, other places, Australia, Taiwan, Hong Kong in some cases, but there's not the political will, I think.
Talking to your question, Jesse, I think that I'd ask someone who was a candidate who was concerned about those kind of things. I'd ask them, what exactly are you worried about? Are you worried that there will be a backlash from the community? And my thought is that what community? There is no one community. So I think it's spurious. I understand where it's coming from, but I think it's spurious.
Okay, time for one more question. Last question.
Within China, prior to Meng Wanghou, you had Confucianism, how that's actually conceived within the Chinese culture. How is it that Meng Wanghou would actually start all of this and take a foreign ideology, particularly communism, was the source of Russia, Marx, Trotsky, and implemented by Stalin. So it's not communism or communist China. It's an actual foreign. It's something that they took from somewhere else and brought in. Why would it not be something internal?
Well, it's very different now, isn't it? Though what we see, the Chinese communism we see now is very, very far from what was conceived in Russia. What we're seeing now is a very, very specific form. I wouldn't even necessarily call it communism, but a very specific form of individualistic dictatorship that was spawned from a collectivist dictatorship that came from Yeah. So we're seeing something very specific. I don't think it's terribly helpful to view modern China through that prism. This is Russian style Marxist communism. I think it's something much more complicated now.
Yeah, but there is this idea that anything foreign is bad in China.
Yes.
And even Mao, when he conceived of Maoism, he was trying to adapt Marxism to China. And Deng Xiaoping, he was trying to push that further. It's like
Mm.
we can have capitalism. Some people can get rich first.
That's communism.
Yeah, that's communism. That's socialism. So I guess in China, it's interesting. Like
It's very pragmatic in a lot of ways, isn't it?
it's a lot of just double speak, or it's like very Orwellian, where you're supposed to believe something, but it doesn't make sense.
It's about the redefinition of democracy.
Yeah, they're always redefined.
Democracy is everyone doing whatever they want.
Yeah, like democracy is we can imprison people. You
Is
know?
that right?
Mm,
Doesn't seem
this
right.
is Chinese democracy now.
Yeah.
So different form.
I'm not sure if that's a very satisfying answer, but I mean, I think that
Hmm. Well, before we go, do you have any last words for us?
thank you.
Yeah, thank you for
Thank you
having
This
us.
was great fun.
Oh, I'm so pleased.
And thank you
It's
for coming on this beautiful Sunday. I mean, I would be out hiking.
very good. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you.
Woo.
Yes, and support